I don't know if anyone has noticed, but there's kind of been a lot of Star Wars content released in the last few years. I can't think of a single one that's been universally well received, and in the conversations and criticism surrounding each release, one complaint is a pretty consistent through line. There was too much filler. Now, this is something I disagree with, and I'd like to dive into why. Filler is loosely defined as the episodes or part of a story that don't have a major impact on the main overarching narrative. There are lots of variations on that depending on what's being talked about, but it's mostly just a blanket term for anything that's like a self-contained side story. To understand the concept better, let's look at some of the biggest examples of filler in recent Star Wars stories, or at least things that have fallen victim to the filler discourse. I think it's worth mentioning The Last Jedi, specifically the Canto Bight sequence. Elsewhere in the film, there's a lot of cool and interesting stuff going on with Luke and Rey, Leia and Poe, Snoke, Kylo Ren and Hux, but they instead dedicated a chunk of the runtime to Finn and Rose on a side mission to a casino. The argument is that their wacky antics at the races added nothing and detracted from the other parts of the story. People were angry about a lot of the things in that film, but the idea that this subplot was filler or padding was one of the most prominent. But because of the nature of filler, the discussion focuses more on episodic TV than it does on films. I first really became aware of it in Rebels. I'm sure it was there for Clone Wars a bit, but that show had the benefit of jumping around to follow new characters in new arcs every few episodes. Rebels had a very different structure. Every episode followed the same cast of characters in their adventures across the galaxy. Because of this, I think every episode was under a bit more scrutiny. It was easier to compare stories because the overall setup would be the same. But what wasn't always the same was the stakes and the relevance to the ongoing narrative. Not every episode was huge. You had a lot of ones where the gang had to collect supplies or steal ships or weapons. The show gave us some truly top-tier Star Wars, but I've seen a lot of people argue that the overall product just isn't worth it because the gaps between those moments are too long. That sentiment carried over to the Clone Wars when it came to the release of Season 7. After an incredible, surprising announcement and 2 years of build-up, expectations were unimaginably high. We were getting one final series, 3 arcs, and one of those arcs was a relatively slow-paced, small-scale and uneventful story about Ahsoka and some sisters getting involved in a little adventure with some crime syndicates. And not only were these Martez sisters women of colour, they were also women, so obviously Star Wars fans were furious. But even the few non-bigots complained that after all the hype, the show returned and wasted its precious few episodes on filler. The Mandalorian is also a thing that exists, and despite what seems to have been an overwhelmingly positive response to the overall show, I've seen a lot of complaints about quite a few individual episodes of it. The Sanctuary, the Gunslinger, the Prisoner, the Passenger, the Siege, and the Believer are considered to be the mostly unimportant and unimpactful stories that you could probably skip on a rewatch. That's 6 filler episodes, out of 16 in total, which is quite a high percentage. And that brings us to The Bad Batch, the most recent Star Wars television series. I have seen literally every episode since the premiere be described as filler. After the first installment established a new status quo of the Batch on the run, every subsequent story has stuck to that status quo. They're doing odd jobs, evading baddies, making allies. A lot like Star Wars Rebels in that way. It's one cast of characters that we follow each week, and I've seen a real mix of opinions about the show so far. A lot of people are impressed with the start, but others are getting bored and demanding that the show gets to the good stuff soon. From the way people talk about filler, you'd assume that most of these things were hated, given that such a large portion is worthless and bad. Surely this is the biggest problem plaguing Star Wars right now. I'm gonna say no. I disagree. I don't think Star Wars has a filler problem. I don't even think filler is a problem. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure I think filler is a real thing. Let's have a look back at all those previous examples of filler and debunk all the issues people have, or in more measured terms, just talk about how I don't agree with that assessment. I'll start with The Last Jedi. I won't give away all of my thoughts on this part of the movie because I think I could probably fill a whole video with them, but I will say that this long chunk of the runtime that people say is dedicated to Canto Bight ends up only being around 10 minutes long, and it features some of the most important Finn moments in the whole trilogy. Again, I'll get into it more at a later date, but it's bizarre that some people act like this was half of the film. I've seen people say that this supposedly unrelated adventure took up 30, 40, 50 minutes of screen time, and that it was made worse by the fact it was unsuccessful, which baffles me because the fact the mission was a failure doesn't mean that it's pointless, it's the point.
The greatest teacher failure is. And on top of that, the events of these scenes introduce us to some of the movie's central themes, and a character that's essential for the epilogue and overall message of the supposedly more important Force side of things. And in the midst of a lot of conversation-y scenes on the ships and on Luke's island, we get some fun, fast-paced set pieces. As much as people were keen to get back to the good stuff, I think these scenes do a great job at making sure the film doesn't slow down too much in the second act. Structurally, it's a bit like the asteroid chase in Empire Strikes Back being spliced in between the Yoda scenes. You could even say that from a plot and character perspective, a lot more happens in the Last Jedi subplot than in Empire's, because that would be true. Like I said, I could go on for longer.
But we must move on to Clone Wars Season 7. I get it. This arc doesn't soar to the unbelievable heights that the series had reached before, but I think it was kind of weird to assume it would. When people look back on the Clone Wars, I feel like they only really remember the most memorable bits. Obviously, great work, Joe, but you know what I mean.
People think of Mortis and Umbara and Mandalore. They don't think of the downtime in between that. The slower, more character-driven stories are a bit more niche. But they were as much a part of the series' identity as the other arcs. And the other arcs were better off for having them. Like this specific story that reintroduces us to the character of Ahsoka. It had been 7 years since her last episode in the show, where we saw her departure from the Jedi Order. But we'd also seen an older version of the character in Star Wars Rebels in the time since then. So when it was time to revisit this character in this very specific period of her life, it made sense to ease us in, bring us up to speed on how she is, how she feels about the events of Season 5. If she'd been thrown straight into the siege of Mandalore like nothing had changed, it would have been as if she'd never left, undoing the impact of her departure for the sake of trimming the fat from the series. The arc also shines an important light on her thoughts and the everyday citizens of the galaxy's thoughts on the Jedi Order, which is something we haven't had a huge amount of. Without these episodes with Trace and Rafa Martez, we wouldn't really have known who this Ahsoka was and where she stood, and that would have severely undercut the effectiveness of her finale. As for The Mandalorian, I am continually baffled by the way people talk about this show. From as early as the 4th episode, I saw people suggesting that it would be better without the baby. But if you take him out, what would the show be? Reskins of the 1st episode every week forever. The setup of the series is Mando and Grogu on the run, and whenever we get an episode that's just Mando and Grogu on the run, everyone loses their damn minds. When their ship gets damaged, or they need to do a little job for someone to earn enough credits to stay on the run, people yell "Boo!" at what they called another wasted week. They demanded cameos, returning characters, connections and teases and cliffhangers, and every episode to be relevant to the series arc. It almost feels like Season 2 was a direct response to the criticisms of the show, and I think it was worse off for it. In incorporating all of those things, The Mandalorian lost a part of its identity. The vibes significantly changed. The small-scale, disconnected character drama about a man and his surrogate son became a Disneyland meet and greet of familiar faces, with consequences that impact the whole galaxy. The filler episodes are the ones where things slow down long enough for us to see how much Din has changed and evolved, along with his relationship with Baby Yoda. And the one-off side stories are where the writers had the opportunity to pay specific homage to the westerns and samurai films that inspired the show, with mini-plots based on a number of famous stories. To me, that's The Mandalorian at its most Mandalorian, the core of the show's identity. It's not a distraction or padding, and it's definitely not filler. The same can be said for Rebels, but with so many more episodes, it's harder to give specific rebuttals. I'll just say that if you were to take out every story that fans deem as unimportant, you'd lose so many moments of the Ghost family bonding, Ezra's Jedi training, the gradual maturing of the show's tone and characters, and the slow burn rise in galactic stakes and tension as the Empire and Rebellion head towards a civil war. And you'd also miss out on a lot of fun. The show is for kids, it's meant to have moments of light goofiness. These less important adventures are absolutely vital to the heart of the show, and it wouldn't be Rebels without them. Bad Batch discourse seems pretty similar to Rebels so far. The complaints started rolling in pretty much immediately, and as I said, the filler label has been given to literally every episode following the premiere. At that point, do you not just wonder if these episodes are what the series is all about? Surely if everything is filler, nothing is. I've enjoyed every single episode so far, and I eagerly await the rest of the series. I don't have this itching need to get to the more major moments. I'm perfectly happy to enjoy the journey and not even fuss about the destination. If we had a whole series of episodes like the ones we've had so far, I'd be happy. It is early days though, so maybe I'll end up eating my words as it progresses. People are wondering whether this mid-season filler structure is a problem with Dave Filoni's Star Wars projects. Patterns are being pointed out, similar minor side characters, similar episodes. I find that last one particularly funny because the examples of reused plots are things as vague and cliched as Seven Samurai episode and Ship Crash Land episode. And I think the series structure is less of a Filoni thing and more of a television thing. But in fairness, Star Wars TV and Dave Filoni's Star Wars are synonymous at the moment, but we'll see if it carries over when other people are handed the reins. It probably will, because I think it's just a consequence of episodic TV. You get downtime, quiet moments, standalone stories within a larger narrative. Sometimes we get an episode we think is unrelated, but it ends up being absolutely vital, like the space whales in Star Wars Rebels, the introduction of Fennec in The Mandalorian, and the introduction of the Bad Batch in the Clone Wars Season 7. But I don't want to dwell on these examples because I don't want to imply that the only filler episodes allowed are the ones that directly set up future stories. It's perfectly okay to just have fun, develop characters, slow down, be the show. No, it's more than perfectly okay, it's important. These stories are where the majority of the exposition, character development, and world building takes place, often without us really even noticing. In television, character arcs happen over a really prolonged period of time. The gradual growth and evolution of these characters and their relationships is portrayed more naturally and authentically over a series of small moments, rather than in a couple of hours of non-stop action. Wrapped up in these fun and low-stakes adventures, we're given details about the galaxy, the conflict, and the characters that make the finale payoff all the more impactful. You can't have a horror film that's just continuous jump scares. You need to have the quiet moments for those high points to land. You can't do a stand-up comedy set that is exclusively punchline. You've got to have some kind of setup. And you can't have a show without filler. This isn't a condemnation of the people that have had these conversations about filler. I've been guilty of it myself in the past, but I've reevaluated the way I look at things. Please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this stuff is all perfect. I think going, all Star Wars is good, you're toxic to criticize things, would be useless and dismissive of people's feelings in a way that's more mean-spirited than positivity ever should be. Complain about these shows as much as you want. I certainly have. Individual episodes can be boring, they can misrepresent the characters, there are all sorts of problems that storytelling can fall into. And I think there is a conversation to be had about whether Star Wars animation stretches certain ideas a bit too thin. That's not something I necessarily agree with, but it's a debate worth having. But to instantly write off literally every episode that isn't immediately obviously important is pretty unhealthy for discourse. And if you get it in your head that you're not allowed to enjoy content if it's not a big story with returning characters and galactic stakes, you're gonna be pretty miserable. This problem in discussion is bigger than Star Wars. Marvel Studios have also recently entered the world of television, and episodes have often been brushed aside and dismissed as just filler when there's no major twist or big moment. I think part of this widespread frustration has come from the streaming service binge model. When we watch a whole series at once, the quieter moments don't matter because we then get the instant gratification just after. Having to wait a week between things feels unusual now, especially in a year where not much has been going on. So when the episodes do arrive and comparatively not a lot happens, people feel betrayed, and they can't just skip ahead to the next episode. The wait just starts again. So as much as I don't like saying, do not criticize the corporation, it is we, the consumer, who are at fault, I think it's kind of true. The point feels overdone, but our attention spans have been positively fucked, and I think we need to collectively get better at acknowledging that. And I don't mean this as stop expecting things, settle for less, because I don't even think we are settling for less. These filler episodes of The Bad Batch, The Mandalorian, The Clone Wars, whatever, are just episodes, often the ones that fit the most with the show's synopsis. I think if people had a chance to see their supposed perfect world where there was no filler, they'd realise that exactly what you want isn't always what you need, which I think is something a lot of people realise with The Rise of Skywalker. Maybe we need a show that cuts out all filler, so that people can see that you can't have an impactful finale if literally every episode is the most important, exciting, action-packed, twist-heavy, force-wielding, cameo-featuring, mind-blowing episode you've ever seen. You reach a point of diminishing returns, which may or may not have already happened. I've seen fan-made lists of Clone Wars and Rebels episodes that cut out all the filler and get you right into the important bits, and I just can't wrap my head around it. For rewatching, sure, but if it's your first time, you miss out on some episodes I consider to be hidden gems, and you deprive yourself of the opportunity to decide for yourself what you consider to be hidden gems. I think my favourite episode of The Mandalorian is probably Chapter 4, which is just Din and Grogu laying low on a lovely forest planet, getting wrapped up in local trouble involving baddies in an Imperial walker. If you took it out of the series, the story wouldn't be affected too much, but you'd miss out on what I think is the best episode of the show. George Lucas's favourite arc of The Clone Wars is one that seems pretty unpopular overall, about a gang of droids in a pretty hopeless adventure on a desolate world. I love it, and think it's one of the most creative and atmospheric stories they ever did, but it's often omitted from the lists that promise all killer, no filler. That's the kind of thing I think is a bit harmful, and I think the constant immediate dismissal of these stories is just a useful excuse for people to not engage with the episodes properly or give them any real thought. So I don't think Star Wars needs to change, on that level at least. I think conversation about Star Wars needs to change. People need to be more accepting of the content they're just dismissing as filler. I don't think it helps anyone to paint with such broad strokes. And on a personal level, you may find you enjoy things a little bit more more once you make peace with the fact that the journey is often as important as the destination. I know it worked for me. Thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments how you feel about filler. You may completely disagree, and that's fine. I don't make these videos because I'm desperate to change people's minds, I just do it to put forward my opinions on these complicated subjects. If you enjoyed the video, remember to give it a like and consider sharing it with other people you think might enjoy it. It really helps the channel a lot. Also subscribe, check out my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Twitch, Letterboxd, links are all in the description. I make videos here every 2 weeks on a number of different topics. I'll see you soon, love you lots.